At 10:14 a.m. on April 15, 1944, Second Lieutenant Robert L. Booth was falling out of the sky over Germany at 500 miles per hour, and he was already dead. He just didn't know it yet. The 19-year-old pilot was strapped into the cockpit of a Republic P.D. Thunderbolt aircraft serial number 4275211. He was in a vertical dive, chasing a German Focke-Wulf 190 that had rolled over and split-hessied toward the ground. Booth had followed him. It was a rookie mistake. The P-47, nicknamed the Jug, was the heaviest single-engine fighter of the war, weighing in at over 17,000 pounds fully loaded. When an object that heavy points its nose at the earth and applies 2,000 horsepower, it doesn't just accelerate, it falls like a dropped anvil. Booth gripped the control stick with both hands, his leather gloves slick with sweat against the rubber grip. He pulled back. He pulled until his triceps burned and the veins in his neck bulged against his collar. The stick did not move. It felt as though it had been set in concrete. The nose of the massive fighter remained pointed straight down, locked on a trajectory that would terminate in a muddy field outside of Hanover in approximately 12 seconds. Booth stomped on the rudder pedals. They were frozen solid. He tried to roll the aircraft with the ailerons. Nothing. The flight controls were completely unresponsive. Booth had entered a flight regime that few pilots in 1944 understood, and even fewer survived. It was called compressibility. As the P-47 accelerated past 450 miles per hour, the air flowing over the thick, laminar flow wings began to move faster than the speed of sound. Shockwaves formed on the upper surfaces of the wings. These shockwaves disrupted the airflow over the tail section, trapping the elevators in a vacuum of dead air. The center of lift shifted rearward, creating a massive nose-down moment that no amount of pilot strength could overcome. The Thunderbolt had become a lawn dart. The German pilot in the Focke-Wulf ahead of him knew this. It was a standard Luftwaffe tactic, dive. The lighter German planes could pull out of a high-speed dive. The heavy American Jugs would hit the compressibility wall and auger in. It was a physics trap, and Booth had flown right into it. The altimeter unwound with terrifying speed. 15,000 feet, 12,000 feet, 10,000 feet. The cockpit was shaking violently. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine was screaming, the propeller tips approaching supersonic speeds, creating a deafening roar that vibrated through the airframe. The rivets on the canopy frame rattled like machine gun fire. Booth was a farm boy from Pennsylvania. He wasn't a test pilot. He wasn't an ace. He was a kid who liked fixing tractors, and right now his tractor was trying to kill him. Panic, cold and sharp, seized his chest. He knew the doctrine: throttle back, wait for thicker air to slow you down, but the ground was coming up too fast. The air wouldn't get thick enough in time. He needed drag. He needed to slow down now. His hands scrambled around the cockpit, searching for the flap lever. The P-47 didn't have dive brakes. Flaps were his only hope. If he could drop the flaps, maybe the drag would slow him below the critical Mach number, breaking the shockwaves. But the cockpit was vibrating so hard his vision was blurred. He reached for the yellow-handled lever on the left quadrant. In his panic, his hand missed by 3 inches. He grabbed the heavy metal lever next to it, the landing gear handle. In a P-47, there are strict limitations on landing gear operation. The technical manual stated in bold red letters, "Do not extend gear above 200 mph. At high speeds, the hydraulic rams aren't strong enough to push the heavy wheels into the slipstream. Or worse, the sheer force of the wind would rip the gear doors off, twist the wings, and disintegrate the aircraft." Booth was doing 520 mph. He slammed the lever down. What happened next defied every engineering calculation Republic Aviation had ever made. The hydraulic system, pressurized to 1,000 psi, engaged. The uplocks released. The massive main gear legs, carrying 42-inch rubber tires, began to cycle out of the wings. The sound was like a cannon shot. Bang! The aircraft shuddered as if it had hit a brick wall. The gear doors hit the slipstream and acted like massive air brakes. The drag coefficient of the sleek fighter instantly quadrupled. Booth was thrown forward into his shoulder harness with such violence that the straps left deep bruises across his chest. His head snapped down, his chin striking the top of the control stick. The G-forces went from positive to negative in a heartbeat. But outside the aircraft, the laws of physics shifted. The massive drag created by the extended gear acted as an anchor. The airspeed dropped precipitously, 500 mph, 450 mph, 400 mph. As the speed bled off, the shock waves dancing over the wings dissipated. The airflow over the tail reattached. The dead air around the elevators vanished. Suddenly, the control stick came alive in Booth's hands. The nose of the P-47 pitched up violently. This wasn't Booth pulling up. This was the natural aerodynamic reaction to the massive drag below the center of gravity. The plane wanted to loop. Booth grabbed the stick, fighting to keep the wings level as the G-forces slammed him back into his seat. The blood drained from his head. His vision grayed out. He groaned against the pressure, executing the M1 maneuver to keep blood in his brain. The horizon sliced back into view. The brown earth, which had been filling his windscreen a second ago, slid away underneath him. He bottomed out at 3,000 feet. He was level, he was shaking, he was alive. Booth looked at his instrument panel. The airspeed indicator was settling at 250 mph. He looked at the landing gear lights. 3 green. The gear was down and locked. He had dropped the wheels at over 500 miles per hour, and somehow they were still attached to the airplane. He looked around for the German. The Focke-Wulf was gone, likely leveled out miles ago, the pilot assuming the American had crashed. Booth reached out with a trembling hand and raised the gear lever. The wheels thumped back into the wells. The P-47, the toughest fighter plane ever built, smoothed out and flew on as if nothing had happened. Booth turned his aircraft west toward England. He didn't radio his flight leader. He didn't say a word. He sat in the stunned silence of his cockpit, listening to the hum of the engine, trying to process what he had just done. He had panicked. He had grabbed the wrong lever. He had tried to destroy his own airplane. And in doing so, he had just discovered the secret to defeating the Luftwaffe's deadliest trap. But as he approached his base at Boxted, a new fear set in. He had to explain this. He had to tell his crew chief why the hydraulic fluid was boiled and the tires were scuffed with grass stains from the air pressure. He had to tell his commanding officer that he had violated every operating limitation in the book. He didn't know it yet, but he wasn't about to be court-martialed. He was about to change the war. When he taxied into his revetment, the crew chief, Sergeant Miller, jumped onto the wing before the prop had even stopped turning. Miller looked at the pilot's face, pale, eyes wide, sweat soaking his collar. "Lieutenant," Miller asked, "you all right? You look like you saw a ghost." Booth unbuckled his mask and took a deep breath of the cold English air. "Chief," Booth said, his voice shaky, "you're going to want to check the landing gear trunnions. I think I might have bent them." "Bent them? How? You didn't even land yet." "No," Booth said, looking at the heavy iron lever in the cockpit. "I didn't land. I used them as brakes." The maintenance report lay on the desk between them like a loaded gun. Captain James Johnson, Booth's flight leader and a veteran with 8 kills, tapped the paper with a nicotine-stained finger. He didn't look angry. He looked confused. And in the 56th Fighter Group, confusion was usually a prelude to a funeral. "Lieutenant," Johnson said, his voice gravelly, "my crew chief tells me your hydraulic fluid is cooked. He says it smells like burnt toast. He also says the main gear tires have stress marks on the sidewalls." Johnson looked up, locking eyes with the rookie. "You want to tell me how you managed to overheat a landing gear system at 20,000 feet? Did you try to park on a cloud?" Booth swallowed hard. The adrenaline from the flight had faded, replaced by the cold reality of military discipline. He had violated the pilot's operating handbook. That was grounds for grounding. "Sir," Booth said, his voice steady but quiet, "I hit compressibility. I was in a terminal dive chasing a Focke-Wulf. The controls locked up. I couldn't pull out." Johnson nodded slowly. He knew the Coffin Corner. He had lost friends to it. And I panicked, sir. I tried to dump the flaps. I grabbed the wrong handle. I dropped the gear." The room went silent. A couple of other pilots playing cards in the corner stopped and looked over. Dropping the gear at combat speed wasn't just a mistake. It was insanity. It was like throwing a transmission into reverse on the highway. "You dropped the gear," Johnson repeated. "At what airspeed?" "Needle was past 500, sir." "And the wings didn't rip off?" "No, sir. It slowed me down. It broke the shockwave. I recovered at 3,000. Johnson leaned back in his chair. He picked up a Model P-47 from his desk and spun the propeller. He was doing the math in his head. The drag, the stress, the hydraulic pressure, it shouldn't have worked. The struts should have snapped. The cylinders should have burst. But there was the plane, sitting in the revetment, solid as a rock. And there was Booth, standing there breathing. "Go get some chow, Booth," Johnson said finally, tossing the report onto the pile. "Don't talk to anyone about this yet. I need to make a phone call." The 56th Fighter Group was commanded by Colonel Hubert "Hub" Zemk. They called themselves the Wolf Pack, and Zemk was the Alpha. He was a brilliant tactician, a strict disciplinarian, and a man who viewed aerial warfare as a science. He didn't believe in luck. He believed in physics. When Johnson brought Booth to Zemk's office the next morning, the mood was tense. Zemk listened to the story without interrupting. He paced the small room, his hands clasped behind his back, staring at the floor. He stopped in front of a technical diagram of the P-47D pinned to the wall. "Let me get this straight, Lieutenant," Zemk said, turning to face the rookie. "You claim that the landing gear acted as a dive brake." "Yes, Colonel." "And you claim that the aircraft is airworthy." "Sergeant Miller says the trunnions are stressed, but the spar is fine, sir." Zemk looked at his engineering officer, Major David Schilling, who was leaning against the doorframe. Schilling was an ace himself, a man who knew the jug inside and out. "Dave," Zemk asked, "is this possible?" Schilling pulled a slide rule from his pocket. He had been doing calculations since Johnson called him. "Theoretically, Colonel," Schilling said. "The main wheels are 42 inches wide. The gear doors are flat plates. If you drop them into a 500 mph slipstream, the drag coefficient jumps by about 400%. It's like deploying a drogue chute." "With the hydraulics hold?" Zemk pressed. "Republic built the system to withstand 3,000 psi surges," Schilling said. "It would be close, but if the gear cycles symmetrically, yes, it would act like a giant air brake." Zemk turned back to Booth. He looked the young pilot up and down. He saw the fear, but he also saw the certainty. Zemk knew that compressibility was the Luftwaffe's greatest ally. The Germans were using the split-S maneuver to bait American pilots into fatal dives. They knew the P-47 couldn't follow them. If this kid had stumbled onto a solution, it changed the game. "Lieutenant," Zemk said, "you say you can do it again." Booth felt his stomach drop. "Do it again, sir." "If this is a valid tactic, it needs to be repeatable. We can't teach a maneuver based on a fluke. I need to know if the gear will deploy consistently at high speed without structural failure." Zemk walked back to his desk and picked up a flight schedule. He scribbled a name on it. "Tomorrow morning, 0800, you're going up. I want you to take a P-47 up to 25,000 feet. I want you to roll over and put it into a terminal velocity dive, and when you hit the lockup speed, I want you to drop the gear." Booth felt the blood drain from his face. Doing it in a panic was one thing. Doing it on purpose, staring at the ground, rushing up, waiting for the death rattle of compressibility, was suicidal. "Sir," Booth stammered, what if it doesn't work this time?" Zemk looked him in the eye. His expression was cold but not unkind. "Then we'll know it was a fluke, and we'll name the crater after you." It was a grim joke, but in 1944, grim jokes were the only kind they had. That night was the longest of Robert Booth's life. He lay in the dark, listening to the breathing of the other pilots. He thought about the mechanics of the P-47. He visualized the hydraulic pump. It was a simple mechanism driven by the engine. It pushed fluid through steel lines to the actuators. At 200 mph, the air resistance against the gear was negligible. At 500 mph, the air resistance was thousands of pounds of force. It was a contest of strength, hydraulics versus aerodynamics. If the hydraulics won, the gear would extend and he would live. If the wind won, the gear would likely rip off the wing spar, tumble back into the tail, shear off the elevators, and he would ride a finless rocket into the English countryside. Booth got up. He couldn't sleep. He walked to the mess hall. He found Major Schilling there, drinking black coffee. "Major," Booth said, "can we beef up the lines just in case?" Schilling looked at the kid. He poured a second cup. "Already done, Booth. We replaced the seals on your bird tonight, and we put a fresh camera in the gun bay. We're going to film the whole thing." "You think I'm crazy, Major?" "I think you're scared," Schilling said, "and that's good. Scared pilots check their gauges. Crazy pilots die." Schilling took a sip. "You know, if this works, you're going to save a lot of lives, kid, including mine." 8 a.m. April 16, 1944. Booth climbed into the cockpit. The familiarity of the controls usually calmed him, but today they felt like the controls of an electric chair. He strapped in tight. He tightened his shoulder harness until it dug into his collarbone. He wanted to be part of the seat. "Wolfpack leader to test 1, Zemk's voice crackled over the radio. "Radio check." "Test 1, loud and clear," Booth replied. His voice was an octave higher than usual. "All right, son, let's go make some science." They took off. The two Thunderbolts climbed through the overcast layer, breaking out into brilliant sunshine at 15,000 feet. They continued climbing to 25,000. The air was thin and cold. "Level off," Zemk ordered. "I'm moving to your 3 o'clock position. Cameras rolling." Booth looked out his right window. He saw Zemk's plane, the famous silver and blue Thunderbolt, sliding into formation. The camera port in the wing was black and unblinking. "Okay, Booth," Zemk said. "Here is the profile. You will enter a 70-degree dive, full throttle. Do not touch the trim. Let the speed build to 450 indicated. Verify control lockup, then deploy gear." "Copy," Booth whispered. He looked down. Through a gap in the clouds he could see the English Channel. It looked very hard. "Initiating run in 3, 2, 1. Booth pushed the stick forward. The nose dropped. The horizon disappeared. The engine roared as gravity took hold. 300 mph. The wind noise began to rise. 350 mph. The vibration started. The instrument panel blurred. 400 mph. The controls began to stiffen. The invisible cement was pouring around the stick. "Speed is 420, Booth called out. "Stick is heavy." "Keep pushing." Zemk's voice was calm, clinical. 450 mph. The plane began to buffet. The shock waves were forming. The stick was dead. He pulled back experimentally. Nothing. He was locked in. "Controls locked," Booth shouted. "I have no elevator authority." "Deploy gear," Zemk ordered. "Now." Booth's hand moved to the lever. His brain screamed at him to stop. Every instinct he had developed as a pilot told him that lowering the gear at this speed was suicide. It felt wrong. It felt violent. But he was a soldier, and he had his orders. He grabbed the heavy iron handle. He squeezed the release trigger. He slammed it down. Wham! It wasn't a mechanical sound. It was structural. It sounded like a sledgehammer hitting the bottom of the cockpit tub. When the massive rubber tires and the flat steel gear doors hit the 450 mph slipstream, the P-47 didn't just slow down. It felt like it had snagged an arresting wire on an aircraft carrier. The drag coefficient of the aircraft instantly quadrupled. Booth was thrown forward against his shoulder harness with shocking violence. The straps dug into his collarbone, leaving deep bruises he would wear for a week. His head snapped down, his chin striking his chest, knocking the wind out of him. But Colonel Zemk, flying tight formation in the chase plane 500 yards away, saw poetry in the violence. He saw the Thunderbolt's nose pitch up. It wasn't the slow, graceful recovery of a pilot gently pulling back on the stick. It was a violent, involuntary reflex of aerodynamics. The massive drag created below the center of gravity acted like a giant hand grabbing the plane's ankles and yanking them back. The nose whipped up, breaking the angle of attack, shattering the transonic airflow over the wings. The shockwaves vanished. The dead air over the tail reattached. The elevator authority returned in a split second. "Recovery," Booth shouted into his oxygen mask, his voice strained by the sudden onset of positive G-forces. "I have control," pulling out. He hauled back on the stick. The massive P-47 swooped out of the dive at 12,000 feet, groaning under the stress, the wings flexing but flying. Zemk slid his plane underneath Booth's. He inspected the gear. "Test 1 looking at your underside," Zemk radioed, his voice calm and clinical. "Gear doors are still attached, struts look straight, no hydraulic leaks visible. You didn't lose them, son." "Roger, Wolfpack leader," Booth breathed, wiping sweat from his eyes. "Though I think I might have bent the seat pan." They circled back to Boxted. Booth retracted the gear. The lights went green. The system had survived the abuse. When they landed, the ground crew swarmed the plane. Major Schilling, the engineering officer, was the first one under the wing with a flashlight. He inspected the hydraulic cylinders. He checked the heavy steel trunnions that held the gear to the main wing spar. "Well?" Zemk asked, walking up, pulling off his flight gloves. Schilling wiped grease from a hydraulic fitting. "Stressed? Yes. We popped a couple of seals, but broken? No. Republic built this thing like a bridge, Colonel. It took the load." Zemk nodded grimly. He turned to the small crowd of pilots who had gathered on the flight line. They were watching, waiting for the verdict. "Gentlemen," Zemk announced, his voice carrying over the sound of cooling engines, "we have a new maneuver. It's ugly. It's violent. And if you do it wrong, it'll probably kill you. But if you do it right, it's the only thing that will save your ass in a compressibility dive." The next morning, the dynamic of the 56th Fighter Group flipped upside down. Usually, the veterans with 10 kills taught the rookies how to survive. Today, the 20-year-old farm boy with 0 kills was teaching the masters. Booth stood in front of a chalkboard covered in aerodynamic diagrams. He drew a vector of drag. "The key," Booth explained, his voice wavering slightly as he addressed men whose photos were in newspapers back home, "is not to hesitate. If you wait until you hit 500 indicated, the hydraulic pump might not be able to overcome the air pressure. You have to drop them as soon as you feel the stick freeze." Major Francis Gabby Gabreski, the leading ace of the 56th, raised his hand from the back row. "And if the hydraulics fail and the gear doesn't retract afterwards, you're sitting duck with your wheels down over Germany." "Then you fly home slow, Major," Booth said, finding his voice. "But at least you fly home." Zemk stepped to the front of the room. He put a hand on Booth's shoulder, a massive endorsement in the wolf pack. "This is now standard procedure for the 56th, Zemk declared. "We are calling it the gear brake maneuver. But hear me clearly, this is for emergency compressibility situations only. It is a get-out-of-jail-free card. Do not use it to slow down for a strafing run. Do not use it to tighten a turn. If you abuse it and break your airplane, I will personally ground you." The news traveled fast. In 1944, pilots talked. They met in bars in London during leave. They transferred between groups. "Did you hear what Zemk's boys are doing? Yeah, dropping their wheels in a dive. Crazy. Maybe, but they stopped crashing." Within a month, the technique had spread to the 4th Fighter Group and the 78th. It wasn't in the official Army Air Force's manual yet. That would take months of bureaucratic review at Wright Field. But it was in the barracks manual. It was knowledge passed from survivor to survivor in the hushed tones of a trade secret. And the Luftwaffe pilots across the channel were about to find out that the rules of the game had just changed. Oberleutnant Karl Heinz was a veteran of the Western Front with 34 kills. He knew the strengths and weaknesses of every Allied fighter. The P-47 Thunderbolt. It was fast, heavy, and incredibly tough. But it couldn't turn tight, and it had one fatal flaw: the dive. Heinz found himself at 22,000 feet with a P-47 boring in on his 6 o'clock. He wasn't worried. He executed the standard escape maneuver. He rolled his agile Focke-Wulf 190 inverted and pulled into a vertical power dive toward the hard deck. "Come on, Ami," Heinz thought. "Follow me down." He watched his airspeed indicator climb. 700 km/h, 800 km/h. He looked back. The massive silver P-47 was still there, growing larger in his mirror, its 8 machine guns winking in the sunlight. "Stupid American, you are going too fast. You will lock up." Heinz waited until the ground was rushing up to meet them. At 2,000 meters, he hauled back on the control stick. The FW-190, with its stiff, highly loaded wings and excellent control harmony, responded instantly. He pulled out of the dive in a crushing high-G arc, leveling out just above the treetops. He looked back over his shoulder, expecting to see a pillar of smoke where the American had augured into the French countryside. Instead, he saw a miracle. The P-47 was still there, but it looked wrong. Its landing gear was hanging down, like a great bird of prey extending its talons. The American plane had slowed dramatically in midair, its nose pitching up violently, refusing to crash. It hadn't hit the ground. It had stopped in midair. And now, as the American pilot retracted the gear, the massive Pratt & Whitney engine roared. The P-47, having shed its excess speed and defeated the shockwaves, was now sitting in a perfect firing position behind the slow-moving German. Heinz didn't have time to be surprised. He didn't have time to react. 8.50 caliber machine guns opened up. A storm of armor-piercing incendiary rounds sawed through the Focke-Wulf's fuselage. The German fighter disintegrated into a cloud of aluminum and burning fuel. High above, the American pilot, Captain Robert Johnson, wiped sweat from his eyes and watched the wreckage fall. He keyed his mic. "It works, Booth. It really works." The hunter had become the prey. The deadliest escape trick had just become an offensive weapon. The war ended for Robert Booth in May 1945. He didn't come home a celebrity. The newspapers were full of stories about generals like Patton and Eisenhower, or the atomic bomb that ended the war in the Pacific. There were no headlines about hydraulic levers or compressibility coefficients. Booth took off his uniform, folded it neatly into a trunk, and put on his denim overalls. He went back to the farm outside Allentown. He married his high school sweetheart, Mary. He got a job at the local John Deere dealership, fixing tractors that had broken down in the fields. For the next 40 years, The man who had rewritten the laws of high-speed aerodynamics spent his days elbow-deep in grease, fixing carburetors and hydraulic lines on combines. He rarely spoke about the war. When he did, it was usually about the cold dampness of the English winter, the terrible powdered eggs, or the friends he didn't bring home. He never told the guys at the shop that he had saved the lives of hundreds of pilots. He never mentioned that his name was whispered in briefing rooms from London to Berlin. To his neighbors, Bob Booth was just a good mechanic, a quiet guy who knew how to make a stubborn engine run. But high above the cornfields where he worked, his legacy was roaring at Mach 1. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, the speed brake became a standard feature on every jet fighter designed by American engineers. The F-86 Sabre used fuselage-mounted brakes to control its dive in Korea. The F-4 Phantom used them in Vietnam to slow down for bombing runs. Every time a pilot popped those brakes to stay on a target's tail or to slow down for a carrier landing, they were using the physics that Booth had battle-tested in a moment of panic. The concept of drag on demand was no longer a trick. It was a fundamental requirement of flight. But the name Booth had largely disappeared from the manuals. The technique had become doctrine, and doctrine rarely remembers the names of the men who wrote it in blood. It wasn't until the late 1980s that the story resurfaced. A dedicated aviation historian named Dr. James H. Hall was researching a book on the P-47 Thunderbolt. He was digging through the declassified mission reports of the 56th Fighter Group, looking for combat statistics. He kept seeing references in the pilot's after-action, reports to a gear extension recovery. April 1944, authorized for emergency use. May 1944, 18% reduction in diving casualties in the 56th Fighter Group. Hall wanted to know who started it. Was it Zemke? Was it Gabreski? He traced the memos back through the chain of command. He found the report from Colonel Zemke authorizing the test flight, and in the margins of a maintenance log he found the name of the test pilot, 2nd LT, R. Booth. Hall tracked Booth down. He was retired now, living in a small house with a porch swing and a garden full of tomato plants. When Hall knocked on the screen door and asked about the gear brake maneuver, Booth looked confused. "You mean the time I grabbed the wrong handle?" Booth asked, wiping his hands on a rag. "Mr. Booth," Hall said, "that wasn't just a mistake. That was the first practical solution to Mach tuck in combat aviation. Do you realize you're in the engineering textbooks? They just don't use your name." Booth smiled. It was the smile of a man who had kept a secret for a long time, not out of shame, but out of humility. "I didn't do it for the textbooks," Booth said, looking up at the sky where a commercial airliner was leaving a contrail. "I did it because I didn't want to die, and I figured if it worked for me, it might work for the other fellas." The story of Robert Booth is more than just a cool war story. It is a profound lesson in the nature of innovation. We often think of progress as a straight line, a team of scientists in white coats solving a problem on a blackboard with complex equations. But in the real world of high-stakes survival, progress is often messy. It is born of panic. It is born of accidents. It is born of mistakes. Penicillin was a mistake. The microwave oven was a mistake. And the solution to the deadliest aerodynamic problem of World War II was a mistake made by a terrified 19-year-old kid who just wanted to slow down before he hit Germany. The genius wasn't in the lever pull. Any terrified pilot could have grabbed the wrong handle. The genius was in the recognition. Booth could have hidden his mistake. He could have landed, told the crew chief he hit some turbulence, wiped the sweat off his face, and never told a soul that he almost ripped the gear off his plane. He would have saved his pride. He would have avoided the risk of being reprimanded. But he spoke up. He told his commander. He subjected himself to scrutiny and skepticism. Because he did, the knowledge was shared. Because the knowledge was shared, lives were saved. That is the definition of a true professional. Not someone who never makes mistakes, but someone who turns their mistakes into lessons for the squadron. Robert Booth passed away in 1991. He never wrote a memoir. He never went on a speaking tour. He never charged a fee for an interview. But every time you see a jet fighter deploy its air brakes, or feel a commercial airliner rumble and slow down on descent, you are feeling his legacy. We believe that the history of war is written by the people, not just the generals. It's written by the mechanics, the rookies, the farm boys, and the accidental heroes who figured it out as they went along. If you believe that Robert Booth's story deserves to be remembered, please hit the like button. It helps the algorithm find these forgotten files and bring them to a new generation. And we want to know what you think. Leave a comment below. What is the best accidental invention you know of? Whether it's in war or in peace, let's talk about how mistakes change the world. Subscribe and turn on notifications. If stories like this remind you why we preserve history, hit that like button, subscribe for more forgotten heroes, and turn on that notification bell so you never miss these stories. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from and whether anyone in your family served in it.